Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome all of you to Tucson Jewish Museum and Holocaust Center's Lakin Lecture Series on Antisemitism. For those of you who I haven't been able to meet yet, I am Lori Shepard. I am the Executive Director, and on behalf of myself, our staff, Board of Directors, and volunteers, we want to thank all of you for taking the time to be here with us tonight, whether you are here in person, which is fabulous, or whether you are joining us live streaming. We are excited to have you. Tonight is our inaugural presentation of the Lakin Lecture Series on Antisemitism. We are so grateful to everyone who helped make this series possible. But there is one very special individual who made it happen. This individual established the Alma and Eddie Lakin Education Fund at the Jewish Community Foundation of Southern Arizona in order to honor her parents, Alma and Eddie. She wanted to recognize and honor their lifelong commitment to Holocaust education, the people of Israel, to Jewish life, and combating anti-Semitism. Each step along the way, as we have designed this lecture series, our team has sought to ensure that all we do honors their amazing legacy and their advocacy for social justice. Now, we all know as we come together tonight that there has been a growing need over the past few years for this type of series. When I sat down to talk with our donor, we both knew that we wanted to start a local conversation about anti-Semitism. We wanted it to be something that was going to look at the ongoing challenges that people are facing through a contemporary lens, not a historic lens. We both recognized that we needed to first define the issue and then try to explore the divergent perspectives if we were going to not only be able to parse this problem, but also fight this problem. I think we can all agree that we come together tonight knowing that tonight's presentation and the lectures and presentations that follow this series is not going to end anti-Semitism. But we are confident that we are going to help educate and empower us as Jews and as Jewish allies. Because the goal of the Lakin Lecture Series on anti-Semitism is to give us a framework, a point of reference for the work that we are all doing in our each individual lives every day to combat not only anti-Semitism, but other forms of exclusion. We want this series to be one that informs us and equips us with not only an understanding of the challenges, but also of the tools that we need to fight this together. That is why we are so honored and excited to begin this lecture series with Arno Rosenfeld as he talks about the battle to define and defeat anti-Semitism. Arno is an enterprise reporter with The Forward, and many of you know that that's the country's largest Jewish newspaper. In fact, they just celebrated this past year their 125th anniversary. In his work, Arno covers anti-Semitism, Jewish philanthropy, American Jewish politics, and he recently won the American Jewish Press Association's Simon Rockhour Award for Investigative Journalism. He won that for his reporting on anti-Semitism and Israeli politics at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., where he currently resides. Before joining The Forward, Arno covered politics for the Casper Star-Tribune in Wyoming. He worked for Wyoming State newspaper, and he has also written for the JTA, the Times of Israel, and a number of other Jewish outlets. Arno's reporting has given him a front row seat to the communities that were grappling with white supremacist propaganda. He has exposed challenges faced by Jewish college students as they confront hostile political climates on campus. And he has examined the rifts among national organizations as they try to grapple with how to best address anti-Semitism. And for those of you who do get The Forward, and I hope that's the majority of you, you know that just this morning, Arno's story in The Forward helped us piece together more information that's coming out about this most recent hate-filled shooting in Jacksonville, Florida. I was just saying to Arno when we were chatting backstage, I could spend a very long time up here talking about all of his work and what he's done and why he's the perfect speaker to kick off the Lakin Lecture Series. But then I wouldn't be giving him enough time. So what I'd like to do is give him plenty of time and also leave some time for questions. So won't you all help me welcome Arno Rosenfeld.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming out. Really appreciate it. Really excited to get to talk about this important issue. And thank you, Lori, for the introduction. I want to thank the Tucson Jewish Museum and Holocaust Center for inviting me, as well as the Tucson JCC and the Lakin family. I'm delighted to see Alma and Eddie's legacy live on through programs like this. I was so honored when Lori reached out to ask if I would deliver the inaugural talk in this series, because I know how important this issue is, and I'm excited to be able to speak with you all about it and also take any questions at the end. I do want to start with a disclaimer. This may not be the kind of speech that you're expecting. The vast majority of what you hear about this topic comes from people who are paid to solve anti-Semitism. And I love to see effective solutions, but finding them is not my job. My job as a journalist is to examine both the problem and those trying to solve it with some distance. That isn't always easy. Sometimes you just want to commend those trying to work on a problem like this, especially such a noble cause like defeating anti-Semitism. But I think we should also encourage accountability from those who we have tasked with our safety. And encouraging that requires distance. What I've observed from that distance is a pitched battle, as the title of my talk says, to define and defeat anti-Semitism in the United States. But it's not a battle between Jews and anti-Semites, or even between Jews and an apathetic general public. It's a battle being waged between Jews. And that's a difficult reality to confront. Some people feel like talking about this battle distracts from the severity of anti-Semitism itself. I disagree. I'm Jewish, I'm proud to be Jewish, I've experienced anti-Semitism, I've witnessed anti-Semitism, I've spent years reporting on anti-Semitism. It is real, and it is dangerous. But this battle is also real, and I believe also dangerous. We ignore it at our own peril. So this evening, I'm going to talk about the contrasting approaches that Jews are taking to address contemporary anti-Semitism, and I'm going to finish with some thoughts about how this battle can distort our understanding of the problem's scale. But let's begin with why things feel so bad right now. What brought all of you out this evening? Why is the Forward paying a reporter to cover anti-Semitism? What's going on? Professor Leonard Dinerstein, of blessed memory, spent his long career at the University of Arizona here in Tucson as the preeminent historian of American anti-Semitism. And if you read his work, you'll learn that things were a lot worse for a lot longer than most of us realize. We may have heard about the university quotas and restrictive housing covenants, but it went much deeper. Members of Congress in the 1940s and 50s used anti-Semitic slurs in floor speeches. One even mailed out copies of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, while another boasted that anti-Semitism was perfectly legal. During that same period, angry youth in New York and Boston, riled up by anti-Semitic propaganda, rampaged through Jewish neighborhoods, beating people and desecrating synagogues. Police participated or stood by. And then there were the bombings. Between 1957 and 1977, there were 13 bombings of synagogues, almost all in southern states by neo-Confederates. There were 7 bombings in 1958 alone. 7 bombings of synagogues. Through the 1950s, many job listings stated Gentiles only, and even after this explicit discrimination began to erode, it would take years more for Jews to be fully allowed opportunities in the workplace. In 1967, the Black Panther newspaper published an anti-Semitic poem fantasizing about destroying Israel that read in part, "We're going to burn their towns, that will be ecstasy, killing every Jew we see in Jewland." As late as 1974, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the highest-ranking military officer in the country, was complaining that Jews owned the banks and media and that we needed to, quote, break the Jewish lobby. But in the decades that followed, systemic discrimination against Jews almost completely disappeared. Anti-Semitic attitudes are far less prevalent today. Left-wing activists call for a boycott of Israel, not mass murder. And instead of joining in anti-Semitic riots, law enforcement, from local police to the FBI and DHS, partner with Jewish organizations to keep us safe. And yet, many of us seem more concerned about anti-Semitism now than Jews were back then. I put the question of just how this could be to Rabbi David Saperstein. Rabbi Saperstein's been on the front lines of these issues since he was hired to lead the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism back in the 1970s. And here's what he told me about the post-war period, that time when, as Dinnerstein documented, Jews were objectively facing a far more severe level of anti-Semitism than we are today. He said, quote, "That was also exactly the time when the Jewish community moved from the peripheries of American society, where we were banned from country clubs and corporate boardrooms and faced quotas in universities, to the very center of American political, academic, and economic life, where we became the most powerful and the most successful Jewish community in the history of the Jewish diaspora, where Jews finally realized the promise of America, that for the first time in human history, this would be a nation in which your rights as a citizen did not depend on your religious identity or beliefs. That didn't get fully realized, like so many promised rights, until the mid-20th century. It changed everything for us. There was a clear feeling of how swiftly things were becoming better back then. And now, you don't have that feeling." End quote. American Jewish concern over anti-Semitism reached its lowest recorded point in 2013, when only 14% of Jews saw it as a serious issue. So what happened next to convince so many Jews, really for the first time in American history, as Rabbi Saperstein put it, that we might be going backward in terms of Jewish safety? The most obvious answer is that Donald Trump ran for president. His platform of populist xenophobia raised the hackles of many Jews. As Stuart Svonkin wrote in his definitive history of the fight against American anti-Semitism, in modern America, Jews have identified their own security with liberalism, just as they identified anti-Semitism with the forces of political conservatism or reaction, end quote. Trump's victory also propelled far-right extremists into the spotlight. The summer after Trump's election, Richard Spencer, famously dubbed the Dapper White Nationalist by Mother Jones magazine, helped organize an event called Unite the Right in Charlottesville, Virginia. The night before the main rally, 200 white supremacists marched through the center of the University of Virginia campus. Diana DaCosta, a Jewish honors student at the time, had been awarded the privilege of living in a historic dorm room at the center of campus, facing the lawn where the Nazis decided to march. At a civil trial 2 years ago, I listened to her recount the terror she felt that night, looking out her window and seeing men marching by carrying tiki torches and chanting, "Jews will not replace us." She scrambled to flip over a poster with Israeli flags and took off her Hamsa necklace before fleeing her room to seek safety. When she stepped outside, the man marching just feet in front of her had a swastika tattooed on his arm. DaCosta told the jury, "It was the most traumatized I had ever felt as a Jewish person. I thought I was going to die if people knew who I was." The pain wasn't over for American Jews. The following year, a supporter of the president who subscribed to the Great Replacement conspiracy, claiming that Jews are trying to replace white Americans with immigrants, murdered 11 worshipers at a Pittsburgh synagogue, the deadliest attack on Jews in US history. Deborah Lipstadt, the renowned Holocaust historian, said following the Tree of Life shooting, quote, "I'm not a Chicken Little who's always yelling, 'It's worse than it's ever been.' But now I think it's worse than it's ever been." By 2019, when there would be another synagogue shooting, this time outside San Diego, the number of American Jews who believed anti-Semitism was a very serious problem had nearly tripled from 2013 to more than 40%. The portion that considered anti-Semitism not a problem at all had fallen from 18% to just 2%. Those numbers have remained at the same level ever since. And that brings us to the question of how Jews responded to this new fear. Many felt that stopping these disturbing incidents required taking on Trumpism, the president's ascendant brand of conservative politics that cast minorities as a threat and reveled in shattering political norms, historic red flags for Jewish communities around the world. Stosh Kotler, then director of the progressive Jewish advocacy group Bend the Arc, gave voice to this following the 2016 election, saying, quote, "Trump has encouraged violence as a tool of politics and emboldened an alt-right movement awash in explicit anti-Semitism. All of this has frighteningly reminded us of the fascist regimes our parents and grandparents came here to escape." Bend the Arc and a small number of other national Jewish organizations, including at times the Reform, Conservative, and Reconstructionist movements, framed their work against anti-Semitism during the Trump years as part of the fight for what they sometimes called a multiracial democracy. Opposing the federal ban on travelers from predominantly Muslim countries, for example, was painted as part of the way to stop anti-Semitism. And this is where we get into the battle. Because, yes, the largest Jewish advocacy organizations, the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee, the Jewish Federations Network, the institutions with massive budgets that set the communal agenda, were alarmed by the rise of the far right. But they also had their eyes on what they considered to be another form of ascendant anti-Semitism during this period, an increase in the quote-unquote delegitimization of Israel. And they viewed this as an equal threat to white supremacy. These groups insisted on a swivel-headed approach toward anti-Semitism, which holds that you can't prioritize which kind of anti-Semitism you go after. You need to be constantly vigilant, swiveling your head, to identify and stop anti-Semitic threats from both ends of the political spectrum. Shortly after the Charlottesville rally, David Harris, then director of the American Jewish Committee, castigated progressives for ignoring what he saw as left-wing anti-Semitism, writing, quote, "There is a real danger emanating from the far right. But the danger doesn't begin and end there, nor, therefore, should our concern and outrage." He went on to rail against, quote, "BDS campaigns, flotillas, flytillas, apartheid weeks, and disruptive protests against Israel." The activists behind these events, Harris argued, deserve the same opprobrium as the white supremacists who called for the mass murder of Jews. This argument, I should say, did not seem to resonate with most Jews. More than twice as many American Jews have consistently said that they see right-wing rather than left-wing anti-Semitism as a very serious threat, according to polling by Harris's own organization. But his comments did reflect the perspective of what we can think of as the Jewish establishment, made up of these major organizations, which tends to be much more supportive overall of Israel and also a touch more politically conservative on other issues than the Jewish public. As a result, we witnessed a quiet transformation in how the Jewish establishment approached anti-Semitism, starting during the Trump administration and carrying on today. If combating anti-Semitism and defending Israel had previously been thought of as separate advocacy tracks, these leading organizations coalesced around a new strategy that joined them together: adoption of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's working definition of anti-Semitism. the IHRA definition, or IRA for short, which I also like because IRA sounds like a very Jewish name to me. The definition was originally drafted in the early 2000s, and its current form was approved in 2017. The text has since become the source of significant controversy, not because of the definition itself, but because of the 11 examples that it's packaged with, 7 of which are about Israel. One says that it's anti-Semitic to deny the Jewish people their right to self-determination, including by describing Israel as racist, which effectively classifies anti-Zionism and other harsh criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic. Another example says it's anti-Semitic to apply double standards to Israel. And it's the adoption of this definition that has become a top priority, sometimes the top priority, for many leading Jewish organizations. This might seem a little strange. If you're going to pick one thing for a government or university to do, adopting a definition feels pretty meager. On the other hand, it's a tangible way for these institutions to show they care. In that sense, it's just like a few years ago when activists called on all these big corporations to release statements supporting the Black Lives Matter movement. Was that going to solve racism? No, but it was a gesture of goodwill. And I think that's where many people who support the IRA definition are coming from. I've seen rabbis and lay leaders in towns around the country ask their city councils, for example, to adopt IRA. But the organizations behind this adoption campaign are looking for something more than a statement of solidarity. We know this because they get very upset when local government officials or university administrators sometimes try to adopt the definition without including the examples about Israel. The Jewish establishment needs those examples included because they want people to accept their view that Jewish identity includes a baseline level of support for Israel, and therefore that it's just as anti-Semitic to reject that baseline level of Jewish support for Israel as it would be to deny the Holocaust. This approach can be seen most readily on college campuses, where the Jewish establishment has sought to persuade administrators that Zionism should be treated as the kind of immutable characteristic, alongside race, gender, and religion, that is covered by anti-discrimination policies. A big win for this approach came in 2020 when the University of Illinois, under pressure from the Education Department, released a statement with the local Jewish Federation that said in part, for many Jewish students, Zionism is an integral part of their identity and their ethnic and ancestral heritage. These students have the right to openly express identification with Israel. The pro-Israel Brandeis Center had convinced the Department of Education to investigate Illinois with a complaint that included this line. Jewish and pro-Israel students are peppered with swastikas by white supremacists on the extreme right while being labeled white supremacists by the extreme left. This was equating activists who claim that Zionism is racism with Nazis. This was the swivel-headed IRA approach in action. And we see it off campus as well. Rashida Tlaib, the Palestinian-American congresswoman from Michigan, who's accused Israel of apartheid, is often compared to Marjorie Taylor Greene, her colleague from Georgia, who's accused the Rothschilds of orchestrating wildfires. Stop Antisemitism, a relatively new advocacy group, names Anti-Semites of the Week. The award has gone to both Kanye West for accusing Jews of destroying his life, and to Honorata Matal, the chair of Ben & Jerry's board, for refusing to sell the company's ice cream in Israeli settlements. In response to all of this, a lot of energy on the Israel-critical Jewish left has been channeled into new definitions of anti-Semitism meant to compete with, or at least augment, the IRA definition. The two most prominent initiatives are known as the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism and the Nexus document. Nexus is a center-left approach recognized by the White House that its authors say can be used in conjunction with IRA and help clarify it. So for example, IRA says it's anti-Semitic to hold Israel to double standards. Nexus says it's anti-Semitic to hold Israel to a double standard because it's a Jewish state, holding open the possibility that there might be a legitimate reason to single out Israel. Meanwhile, the Jerusalem Declaration, or JDA, is to the left of both Nexus and IRA and expressly defends the BDS movement to boycott Israel from claims of anti-Semitism. IRA's strongest supporters have responded to both Nexus and the JDA with a scorched earth approach, painting them as dangerous threats to Jews. Although the three actually have some common ground on Israel. All three consider things like blaming Jews for the actions of Israel or requiring Jews to take positions on Israel to be anti-Semitic. All three also include nods in different ways to the Jewish right to self-determination. But the debate over the swivel-headed approach isn't just about how to define anti-Semitism in relation to Israel. It's about how we handle a belief that I'd guess many of us as Jews feel sometimes, that we're under siege from all sides. Elon Carr, Trump's anti-Semitism envoy, expressed this view during a 2019 speech in London. He said, quote, "Anti-Semitism is on the rise everywhere, regardless of geography, regardless of context, regardless of country. It's critical to remember our three disparate sources of anti-Semitism: far right, far left, and militant Islam. Just think about it. These groups should hate each other more than they hate anything else on earth, and yet they find themselves strangely united by their hatred of the Jewish people," end quote. This view holds that all anti-Semitism, no matter its source, is basically the same. These people just hate Jews, and it all poses an equal threat. But critics of the IRA definition and head swiveling have a different analysis of anti-Semitism. They see anti-Semitism not as blind hatred, but as a tool that people use to achieve various goals. In her famous 2007 zine on why the left should fight anti-Semitism, April Rosenblum wrote, "Anti-Semitism's job is to make ruling classes invisible. It protects ruling class power structures, diverting anger and injustice toward Jews instead." During the Trump administration, a coalition of Jewish groups created a messaging document to help politicians and Jewish leaders talk about anti-Semitism. They suggested describing it in this way, quote, "Anti-Semitism is used to manufacture division and fear. So no matter the source, it always benefits politicians who rely on division and fear. Anti-Semitism is part of the same machinery that targets black and brown people, immigrants, Muslims, and more. This is the explicit strategy of the right wing in America and around the world. So while it's true that anyone can fuel anti-Semitism by repeating a stereotype, ultimately, all anti-Semitism benefits those who derive their political power from fear and division," end quote. This understanding has failed to catch on with the Jewish establishment. Partly, that's because, unlike the swivel-headed approach, it's hard to claim that it's nonpartisan. If you condemn both Donald Trump and Ilhan Omar, you can tell politicians and donors on both sides of the political aisle, look, it's nothing personal, we condemn anti-Semitism regardless of its source. But if instead you were to say, Trump uses anti-Semitism to build political power by blaming George Soros for urban crime, whereas Omar made a mistake by invoking an anti-Semitic trope, but we know she's opposed to the kind of hatred and division that endangers Jews, well, now that doesn't sound very nonpartisan. And there's another political element here. A lot of the recent money pouring into the fight against anti-Semitism has come from just a handful of big donors, many with their own political agendas. I had breakfast with Abe Foxman earlier this year, and he shared a story about Sheldon Adelson, the late casino magnate. The two had a falling out during the Obama administration. Adelson thought the ADL was becoming too liberal, too soft on Obama. But even after Adelson stopped donating, Foxman still made a point to go visit him in Las Vegas every year. As you might imagine, these were not pleasant meetings. But Foxman said, I had to keep Sheldon in this bear hug. I had to keep him close, because with one stroke of his pen, he could write a check and create an organization that would destroy the ADL. Well, Adelson's no longer alive, and Foxman stepped down from the ADL in 2015. But since then, more than 40 new organizations dedicated to stopping anti-Semitism have been created, many with the stroke of a single donor's pen. In 2019, for example, Adam Barron, a Jewish oil magnate, secretly funded the creation of the Combat Anti-Semitism movement, which has grown into a coalition of more than 600 Jewish organizations, including the American Jewish Committee, and until very recently, the Jewish Council for Public Affairs and the Jewish Federations of North America, where Baron Sister is actually board chair. The Combat Antisemitism movement has gone all in on promoting the IHRA definition. It's also been very harsh on the political left, recently losing a few prominent coalition members after releasing a video that described woke politics, quote unquote, as inherently anti-Semitic. Meanwhile, Barron has also been a prolific donor to Republicans, including Trump and Wisconsin Senator Ron Johnson. Johnson drew the ire of several major Jewish groups, although notably not the Combat Antisemitism movement, for holding up Deborah Lipstad's nomination to be Biden's anti-Semitism envoy, which left the position vacant for several months. Billionaires like Ronald Lauder, Paul Singer, and Robert Kraft, a close friend of Trump's, have all funded major initiatives to combat anti-Semitism, as have many other donors who tend to either be staunch conservatives themselves or at least adherents to the kind of AIPAC model of supporting conservative pro-Israel politicians. Most of these new groups are extremely reluctant to accept any understanding of anti-Semitism that places special blame on the political right, and they're adamant about ensuring that the left receives equal, if not more severe, opprobrium. It's notable that the Jewish organizations that have the largest actual constituencies, the liberal religious denominations, for example, and the ADL, which still relies a lot on grassroots fundraising, are also the groups that have been harshest on right-wing anti-Semitism. Okay, at this point, I hope I've explained the two major sides of the battle here. Do we want to focus all of our energy on fighting white supremacists, or also put major resources toward defending Israel and cracking down on sort of harsh rhetoric or demonization of the Jewish state? Now I want to talk about how this connects to the way we think about anti-Semitism. You may have noticed a pervasive sense lately that things are getting desperate for Jews. A veteran Jewish political pundit told the Washington Post last fall, quote, "We're back to keep your head down, no one has your back. It's not that we're back to real estate bans, it's more the old, it's a little unseemly to be Jewish," end quote. This idea has also come through in a new wave of public service announcements funded by some of the billionaires I just mentioned. In one national television ad, a mother walking her young daughter to the car for school sees that someone has spray painted "No Jews" on the family garage alongside a swastika. The ad closes with a stark message. 1 in 4 Jewish Americans were the victim of hate last year. And when a coalition that represents much of the Jewish establishment ran a series of ads last Hanukkah, they likewise presented Jews as a forsaken group. The narrator described anti-Semitism as, quote, "one form of hatred in the US, often passed off as legitimate discourse or just ignored." And then there was the cartoon of a sad young Jewish boy that was circulated on Instagram by an Orthodox Jewish group last summer. It showed other kids taunting the boy alongside the text, quote, "If you're Jewish, somebody hates you. That's always been true, and that's intrinsic to who you are. If you're Jewish, somebody hates you, and that's intrinsic to who you are." These messages often resonate because they draw on something real. The synagogue shootings, Orthodox Jews being beaten on the streets of New York, anti-Semitic outbursts by celebrities, online trolls, and even politicians. And we all saw yesterday in Jacksonville a racist mass shooting carried out by a man using a gun covered in swastikas. But at the same time, there are actually many reasons to feel good about the state of Jewish life in the United States. Rob Eschman, former editor of the Jewish Journal in Los Angeles, and my colleague at The Forward, pointed this out in a rejoinder to Dara Horn's popular 2021 essay collection called "People Love Dead Jews." He wrote, "Here's the misleading part. The vast majority of people like living Jews. They really do. Governments and the public stood by Jewish communities when they faced attacks in Pittsburgh, San Diego, Muncie, and elsewhere." And Eschman went on to describe the polls showing that Jews have the highest favorability of any religious group in the country. He concluded, "I get it. People like living Jews more than any other religious group is a terrible book title. But it's a fact," end quote. And the PSAs, sometimes they're a bit misleading. The one with the vandalized garages said that 25% of American Jews were the victims of hate. But they were citing a survey referring to the share of Jews who had been the target of an offensive comment, including online. These are deplorable, of course, but an anti-Semitic message on Twitter doesn't really compare to having your family's home targeted by Nazis. And we know from ADL data that thankfully, the scene depicted in the ad almost never occurs in the United States. Yet there was a $25 million advertising campaign suggesting to millions of Americans, including Jews, that this is a prevalent problem. And the claim that anti-Semitism is the only form of hatred being ignored in the US, that aired while the White House was in the middle of creating the first ever federal strategy to counter anti-Semitism, something that doesn't exist for any other form of hatred. So given that there's so much good to go along with the bad, why does it seem like the leading Jewish advocacy groups are choosing to aggravate our fear of anti-Semitism rather than calm it? Why are they choosing to emphasize the bad? Take the ADL's 2021 audit of anti-Semitism, in which the organization claimed to have identified a 34% increase in anti-Semitism. It turned out most of that increase came from a big change in methodology, and using the old method, the real increase was 10%. These kind of inconsistencies emerge almost every time you scrutinize recent studies of anti-Semitism conducted by advocacy groups. And they almost always err on the side of suggesting anti-Semitism is more widespread rather than less. It wasn't always this way. There have been periods of American history when these same organizations aggressively downplayed anti-Semitism, sometimes to a fault. There's a story from 1949 that illustrates this phenomenon. Paul Robeson, the famous baritone and communist sympathizer, wanted to hold a concert in the summer in upstate New York. When the conservative townspeople in Peekskill, a little hamlet north of the city, and a popular vacation destination for working class Jews, found out that he was going to be performing nearby, they were furious. That the audience was thousands of socialist Jews and African Americans only made them more angry. Robeson managed to perform, but as concertgoers left the venue, they were greeted by protesters chanting and holding up signs calling the Jews dirty K-words and other slurs. Police and townspeople threw stones at the attendees, pulled them from cars, and left them beaten and bloodied. The ACLU found at the time that the riot was, quote, provoked largely by anti-Semitism, growing out of local resentment against the influx of Jewish summer residents, end quote. But the country's largest Jewish groups didn't want to condemn the violence. They worried about lending credence to the anti-Semitic canard that communism was a Jewish plot. Some Jewish leaders even thought these socialists got what they deserved. Commentary magazine, which was still the official journal of the American Jewish Committee at the time, claimed that Robeson and his Jewish supporters were responsible for provoking the anti-Semitism, and that they were therefore no better than Nazi agents during World War II. Other instances of violent anti-Semitism during that period were similarly downplayed. For example, the synagogue bombings during the 1950s and 60s were not portrayed as part of a wave of anti-Semitic violence. On the contrary, many Jewish organizations didn't even consider them to be expressions of anti-Semitism. After all, the neo-Confederates were only targeting the congregations that spoke out in favor of civil rights. That wasn't about religion, it was about politics. These might seem like unconscionable decisions today. Can you imagine if the ADL had responded to the Tree of Life shooting by saying, well, of course it was a detestable act, but it wasn't anti-Semitic. It was about the congregation's support for refugee resettlement. But my point is that the way we talk about anti-Semitism is a choice. What might seem like obvious responses today would have been completely different a couple decades ago, and will no doubt change again. So I'll ask again, what's behind the choice that many organizations are making today to emphasize the severity of contemporary anti-Semitism? There are a bunch of factors, and they aren't all political. But a big one is that the swivel-headed IRA solution preferred by the Jewish establishment is controversial. If you go to a university president, for example, and say, hey, I'd like you to adopt a policy declaring that it's anti-Semitic to call Israel racist, you're going to be met with a lot of pushback. The leading Jewish organizations know this, and so they tend to avoid emphasizing Israel in their advocacy for IHRA. When they lobby for it, as they did in a last-ditch effort to get the White House to endorse the definition this past spring, they talk about it as the gold standard definition and emphasize all the major Jewish groups that support it. They don't say, we're asking you to define anti-Zionism as a form of anti-Semitism, or please say that it's anti-Semitic to accuse Israel of apartheid. Now, I think someone else in this lecture series has the unenviable task of diving into the merits of those beliefs. My point is simply that they represent a controversial solution to anti-Semitism. And what do you do when you have a controversial solution? You emphasize, and sometimes even overstate, the scale of the problem you're trying to solve. You go to that university president or to the White House and say, look, there's this unprecedented wave of anti-Semitism. Jews are afraid to walk down the streets. They can't even attend college anymore. We're getting hit from the right and the left, and celebrities hate us. And all we're asking for you to do is adopt this simple definition of anti-Semitism. And I should say that we occasionally see the inverse of this. There are some people so opposed to the idea that any criticism of Israel might be anti-Semitic that they seek to understate the severity of anti-Semitism. Jewish Currents magazine published a controversial editorial 2 years ago that basically said progressives shouldn't respond to the IHRA definition by highlighting right-wing anti-Semitism. They should just stop talking about anti-Semitism. They argued, quote, in the left's attempts to fight the right smears and to bolster our anti-Semitic bona fides, we have unintentionally helped validate a destructive rhetorical weapon. At the same time, we have entrenched a worldview that positions Jews as humanity's ultimate and unrivaled victims. This kind of Jewish exceptionalism poses a substantial obstacle to meaningful coalition work with those facing much greater marginalization and violence than white Jews, end quote. In other words, this argument holds that there's something inherently reactionary and counterproductive about talking about anti-Semitism at all. But the reality is that these dissident voices on the left have relatively little influence. The conversation is dominated by the organizations promoting the swivel-headed IHRA approach, who tend to overstate the pervasiveness of contemporary anti-Semitism. Now you might be thinking, fine, maybe it's better to err on the side of overstating the danger we're in, especially if that's what's required for people to take our demands seriously. We live through centuries of vicious persecution. Surely we shouldn't take this brief era of prosperity as an opportunity to let our guard down. And I'm not suggesting that. But I do want to talk about how our fear of anti-Semitism and our belief in its widespread prevalence can sometimes eclipse and even shape our reality. Late last fall, I got an email alert for an article in the Arizona Republic. UA professor is dead because no one took anti-Semitic threats seriously. I was stunned. Anti-Semitic murders are vanishingly rare in the US and inevitably become major national news. Had everyone missed an anti-Semitic murder here in Arizona? I ended up speaking with a lot of folks in Tucson about the absolutely heartbreaking and infuriating murder of Thomas Meixner, a beloved hydrology professor at U of A. I learned that anti-Semitism definitely played a role in the crime. The disturbed graduate student who shot Dr. Meixner was a virulent anti-Semite who even seemed to mistakenly believe that Dr. Meixner was Jewish. The shooting took place across the street from the Hillel building on Yom Kippur, and I spoke with the students who were forced to shelter inside. You can only imagine how scared they were that day and how it felt to subsequently learn that the perpetrator had been making violent anti-Semitic threats for months, and that law enforcement had failed to intervene or warn the Jewish community. But I also learned that, contra the headline in the Republic, there's no indication that police didn't take the threat seriously because they were anti-Semitic, or that the killer was primarily motivated by anti-Semitism. The killer had also railed against Asian people, sexually harassed and stalked female students, terrorized his neighbors, and made specific threats against other faculty members who he did not believe were Jewish. Police didn't take any of these threats seriously. That nuance was missing in the op-ed, which was written by the leader of a prominent national Jewish organization nearly 2 months after the murder, and it spread like wildfire among Jews online. One Instagram post from an affiliate of the World Jewish Congress that helped make the incident go viral declared, quote, "A professor at the University of Arizona was shot because a student thought he was Jewish. When we say anti-Semitism kills, we mean it." Several Jewish students on campus told me that this oversimplified version of events slotted a little too neatly into a narrative of pervasive anti-Semitism. One student told me, quote, "I hate to make it seem like people were jumping on a bandwagon, but I think it was just seen as another drop in the bucket," end quote. It was just one more instance of campus anti-Semitism. And the way the story was presented by national Jewish groups had damaging repercussions in Tucson. The Hillel was inundated with angry phone calls. "Why aren't you doing something about this? It's a shanda. This isn't all over your social media accounts." They had, in fact, been meeting with top university officials and posting on social media 2 months earlier when the shooting actually took place. Now it felt like all that work was being erased. Another student, Jordan Morris, told me that, quote, "In a certain way, the social media outrage brought our community back to square one of the healing process," end quote. And that's the rub with all this. There is a danger in sounding the anti-Semitism alarm first and looking into the details later. Dr. Meichner's death was an especially intense example, but I could give you dozens of cases where the initial report of an egregious incident of anti-Semitism turned out to be far more complicated and far less menacing for the Jewish community. And just as shining the spotlight on U of A had a negative impact on Jews here, the belief that we're experiencing an unprecedented epidemic of anti-Semitism has an impact on Jews everywhere, especially young Jews. Sarah Fredman Ader, who works at NYU's Hillel, wrote this about her conversations with Jewish freshmen at the school, quote, "Many students echoed fear of outing themselves as Jewish. One young woman told me she chose not to hang a mezuzah on her dormitory door. Another student pulled her Star of David necklace out from under her shirt where she told me she hid it. Yet most students also claimed that they personally never experienced anti-Semitism. Their fear was informed by what they read online. A student who chose not to wear a yarmulke on campus told me, 'I'm pretty accepted for who I am, but you hear stories of anti-Semitism all across America. So maybe I'm just taking the kippah off because of that," end quote. There is a price. That's the message I want to close on. There's a price we pay for how we choose to think about anti-Semitism. Often, it's a price we pay in fear. Fear that compromises Jewish life in its own way. Fear that convinces us our neighbors, acquaintances, or strangers might respond with hostility rather than curiosity, warmth, or indifference if they knew that we were Jewish. And so we stop and think twice about hanging a mezuzah or wearing a Star of David. We hold back mentioning our Hanukkah plans to our colleagues. Now, as I said at the start, anti-Semitism is real, and it is dangerous. For that reason, how we balance protecting ourselves and our community with the limitations imposed by fear is a very personal calculation, and it should be. How much comfort do we find in being part of, as Rabbi Saperstein put it, the most powerful and successful Jewish community in the history of our people? And how much do we dwell on this other fact, that some people hate us because we're Jewish? What does Jewish safety look like to us? I've spoken a lot about how other people answer that question. But even as our communal institutions duke it out, this is ultimately a question we all have to answer for ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You gave us new ways of looking at anti-Semitism, but also new ways of exploring what it does mean to think about that, new ways of thinking for ourselves. So we're going to move into the question and answer portion of this program. Before we do, I want to apologize because the folks online don't have that ability. So the privilege belongs to those of you who are in the room. And the only thing that I'm going to say as we get started is, Arno, you can stay where you are. Lynn and Ori and I are going to move through the room with microphones. I am going to ask that you limit yourself to one question so that everybody has a chance to be heard. And also, and this is the hard part, you limit your extra comments, please, to just a question. So go ahead. Ori, you want to grab this first question right here?
I was just wondering if you could state the actual definition, what it is, and I did have a second question as to who in this room has experienced personally anti-Semitism, because I myself not.
Sure. Well, if we want to start with the second part, I don't know if folks are comfortable if you want to raise your hand if you've experienced anti-Semitism. Great. Thank you. I can state the definition, but I don't want to do it purely from memory. It's a little bit of a weird definition, but the definition itself is pretty unremarkable. It's like a sentence and a half. If you Google IRA working definition or IRA anti-Semitism, it should be one of the first results. It basically says anti-Semitism is a certain belief or set of beliefs about Jews that can be expressed as prejudice or other forms of hatred. Some people do knock it because it doesn't talk about a belief in anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, like if you think a secret cabal of Jews run the world, but you're not necessarily hateful toward that cabal. So there is some dispute about whether it's actually a good definition, but the definition itself is not really the contested part. The JDA is like 800 words or something, so I can't recite that one. Do you want me to call on, yeah, whatever works.
Okay, can I take it? The interesting thing is this. I've never experienced anti-Semitism, but the history of what the Jews have gone through does trigger certain feelings that we may not experience, but we feel. So when there is an incident of anti-Semitism, even though I may not be involved and I'm not part of it, it triggers the memories of what my parents have gone through in Europe, what a husband of mine has gone through in the Holocaust, and this is the stuff that is very hard to escape from. So it is. These are the triggers that I wonder about.
I'm sorry, we're going to keep it to questions. Did you have a question here? Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, and one thing that I didn't touch on in the talk, but that's important here, and it's kind of academic and probably a little bit beyond my scope of expertise, but just to mention, there are sort of two views of anti-Semitism. One is that, it's existed from time immemorial, and that when we see an expression of anti-Semitism, it is drawing from that well of, hate and conspiracy about Jews that you can trace back to the Middle Ages and earlier. And so that's why, if your kid is bullied in school for being Jewish, you might think that's the same strand of hatred that led to the Holocaust, as opposed to, hey, kids bully everyone who's different. They're also bullying, kids of other faiths, kids who wear glasses, kids with red hair, what have you. And so, one strand of the view sees it as sort of a continuing thing that keeps bubbling up. The other sees it as more similar to other forms of racism that, instead of being cyclical, when we see anti-Semitism in the United States, sometimes it's just another form of hate and prejudice that we see toward black folks or Muslim folks. So yeah, but I think a lot of people are very moved by what you mentioned, that this might not be affecting me right now, but I know how bad it got before, and so I'm concerned.
Hi, I know we're not supposed to comment, but I just wanted to say I really appreciate your articles in the forward. They help get me through the day.
Those are okay comments.
Yeah, and I did appreciate your article on the university situation here. But One thing that the Forward hasn't really covered, that actually the Republic did a good job of covering, is the Republican Party anti-Semitism here in Arizona. We had a scary time here last year. The top 4 statewide candidates all dabbled in various forms of anti-Semitism, and I'm getting to a question. And the problem that we have is yes, we have our left anti-Semitism too, but they're fringe here. In our Arizona Republican Party, people like Paul Gosar and our statewide executives are promoted to leadership positions. So what do we do about that?
That's above my pay grade or scope of my job, but yeah. I think there's a lot of concern about these things. I don't have the political solution for you, though.
Thank you very much for your exquisite overview and a follow-up to this gentleman. We all know there are different types of anti-Semitism, theological, cultural, and political. When you ask, have any of us ever been exposed to that? But my question is, as someone relatively new living in Tucson, I've only been here 2.5 years, what are we doing in the community among the other churches and other forms? And how can we bring people together more to be understanding and work together?
And I think that maybe the series after this is talking about security in the community, which might touch on that. Not having been in the community, I can't really answer that, but it's an important question.
It is the next Lakin lecture series. It is September the 28th, and there will be a local panel, and it will include everyone. Lynn Davis will moderate that, and it will include individuals from our security team here in Tucson. Also, it will include local religious leaders and folks from the university. So we will address your question in full at the next Lakin lecture series.
We have a question here.
Isn't there more of a danger in minimizing anti-Semitism than in exaggerating anti-Semitism?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what I was speaking to at the end. I could ramble about my own views on the subject, but I think ultimately it's a choice that we all have to make. So I think it's important to understand, what we can objectively about the scale of the problem, but at the end of the day, you're talking about a tolerance for risk and danger and, how much you're okay with a little bit of fear or putting up taller walls or more security around your institutions, how much you want to focus on openness. It's a good question. I think a lot of people certainly agree with you that there is more danger in understating than overstating, but it's a sort of personal calculus.
Yes, I've had a number of experiences with anti-Semitism, both in Germany and in the United States, in multiple locations. What I would like to see addressed is how do we go about responding when we have these things? Why are we not talking about it? Why are we not strategizing how we're going to respond? We need to find good ways to respond to this that are effective and peaceful.
I agree.
Can you comment a little bit about what political inroads the equation between Zionism and anti-Semitism is making in American government?
Sorry, can you state it one more time? The inroads that
Between equating Zionism with anti-Semitism.
Yeah. So, I mentioned that this was the top priority for a lot of, not that equating the two is the top priority, but that getting the government and other institutions to adopt a framework that sees those two things as usually, if not always, equivalent. When Biden took office shortly after January 6th, like the next week, the ADL, B'nai B'rith, Hadassah, the Conference of Presidents, sent a letter they claimed to be on behalf of the Jewish community to the Biden administration, and they said that their top priority for his administration when it came to Jewish issues was tackling campus anti-Semitism. Their preferred approach is that the education department consider anti-Zionism to be basically a form of discrimination. And it's been pretty effective. They had a lot of success with that during the Trump administration. The Brandeis Center that I mentioned was founded by, and he left to be Trump's civil rights, worked in the civil rights division, I think in the education department, something like that, Ken Marcus, and he's gone back to the Brandeis Center. So it's more effective in Republican administrations. The Biden administration has been very, very sympathetic to it, although they've stopped short a couple times of fully embracing or adopting that view. But it's definitely making headways at the federal level and also in a lot of state legislatures.
I have a question for you. I have a question for you and for everyone in actual fact. First of all, I hate in any way, shape or form hatred. Also, the second thing I have to say is I am not Jewish, I'm not religious in any way, but I come to your meetings because I feel that the Jewish people have been untreated, treated badly worldwide for many years, and I studied Second World War Germany and Nazi Germany. And I would like to know, the answer I've always wanted to know is why is there so much hatred towards the Jews?
Yeah. You know, I mean, that connects to I think the first question of like, that certainly we've seen anti-Semitism all over the place for many years, centuries. Again, that's a little bit more, getting into the full history is probably a little bit more academic than I have, but I think, the April Rosenblum quote is about Jews serving as a scapegoat. And, if you look at Europe, where you sort of had the original form of anti-Semitism, Jews didn't really fit in. You had the states were tied hand in hand with the church. Jews didn't fit in as part of that. They were marginalized in a bunch of ways. Then they were pushed into roles that then it was easy to get mad at them about, banking or other forms of finance. So I think they've served as a scapegoat. And I think, one of the reasons that we haven't seen more systemic anti-Semitism in the United States, we haven't seen more virulent anti-Semitism, despite what we have witnessed throughout history, is that we found other scapegoats. You look at the most marginalized groups throughout American history, they weren't Jews. They had somebody else to blame their problems on, someone else to run out of town. But there were a lot of countries throughout history that haven't had that. And we also know that there's a lot of anti-Semitism in countries that have very few Jews, which is disturbing and alarming in its own way. But it's really hard to root out conspiracies that let you say, oh, my problems aren't something that I can address in my community. They aren't something I need to go up against the actual identifiable power structure, the people in government or power. I can just blame this shadowy force off to the side, and often Jews have played that role.
Thank you. I know that you addressed the difficulty of defining anti-Semitism and trying to figure out what should be included or what shouldn't be included, what can be included. I wonder if sometimes I'm not imagining whether or not there's anti-Semitism, and I'd like to give an example and find out whether you think it was anti-Semitic or not. But I was watching the Republican debate last Wednesday, and I thought that DeSantis threw in a gratuitous reference to George Soros supporting liberal district attorneys. And as soon as I heard the reference to Soros, I thought, well, that's just anti-Semitic. But is it? How do you define it? And is he just being flagrantly, is he trying to ignite subtly anti-Semitism?
Yeah, there have been books written about this. I'll plug one by Emily Tamkin about the demonization of George Soros. It's really hard to answer, and I think that actually brings me to a point that I also didn't make, but that I want to, which is that a lot of energy gets put into, is something anti-Semitic or not, as if the answer to that will then open up a solution. And I think that certainly that's important to do sometimes, and there are blatant cases of anti-Semitism that need to be named and called out, but there are a lot of these edge cases. I mean, so many things are anti-Semitic tropes. George Soros does give money to various causes. So I think it's hard to give a yes or no answer, but I think you can look at, is blaming a shadowy figure, a type of effective politics? Is it something that is constructive, or is it not? And you can look at that on campus too, with Israel politics on campus. We can spend a lot of time debating whether this or that slogan or event is anti-Semitic, but what's the impact it's having on Jews on campus? What's the impact it's having on the campus climate? And answer that question, because that's a much more interesting question. So I don't have a yes or no, but it comes up in a lot of spaces.
Thank you very much for an historical perspective, especially in regard to the events since the 60s and 70s. I was totally unaware of the shift that had taken place in that period. I also appreciate your journalistic approach, where you're not offering really any kind of commentary as to what we should do. So that's where I was left at the end of your speech. That the question is,
One of my board members, I can do that.
yeah, the question is, and this is what I was left with. Okay, what do we do?
Yeah. And again, I wish if I had the answer to that question, and it is shocking, and I really think that there's, if I can editorialize a little bit, a certain dereliction of duty, because if you go to a lot of the organizations that are working on this full-time, hundreds of people, tens of millions of dollars in budgets, and you say, and I'm actually working on a project that's trying to answer this, so hopefully we'll surface some good answers, but you say, okay, you're identifying the problem in this way and that way. What's proven to work? Like, what do we know works? They'll go, yeah, that's a great question. And of course, they're not incentivized to answer it, because that would mean testing all of the programs that their donors give them money for, and if the tests come back negative, then they're in trouble. So I don't think it's nefarious, but I think there are reasons that people don't track effectiveness. You know, one of the things that really struck me in looking at, because I do a lot of reporting on campus anti-Semitism, when you talk to Hillel leaders who've been there for a little bit of time and seen, they talk about a big surge in just casual anti-Semitism, people making offensive comments in class or at parties following Trump's election, which I think relates to an overall coarsening of the political discourse. When people feel more emboldened to insult minorities or don't feel bound by historic political norms, that has blowback on Jews and other minorities. And the flip side of that is cultivating a strong democracy, and where people have relationships with each other across lines of difference, and those sort of things. When those are doing well, things usually go pretty well for Jews, but that's not something that an organization can really conjure into being, and so we're left without an answer.
Okay. I heard a lot of questions, I heard a lot of comments, but bottom line, what's going on with the Jewish? They don't say anything, they don't do anything, everything is behind closed doors. Bernie Sanders, he's Jewish. Hold on. He's Jewish and he's against Israel.
Is there a question?
Yeah, that's question. He wanted to cut the...
Okay, ma'am, we're doing, there has to be a question.
You made me think, and I appreciate that very much. So I'm making a leap with your presentation about the mainstream, more wealthy. We think of AJC, the Federation, being more opposed to the left-wing anti-Israel criticism, right? Did I hear that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Do you think they're behind no labels?
I actually, I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with No Labels. They're sort of this group that's trying to run a third-party candidate. They've been around for a while. I interviewed the founder before I was at the Forward for like a casual profile, and I asked some question about I touched on something, and she got very stressed out and asked if we go off the record. I don't remember what she said, but it was a sort of strange experience. But I remember talking to her, and I said, because she said, well, our goal is we should just be able to find a middle ground, right? Just kind of the swivel-headed thing, right? We should just be able, on every issue, we think the answer is in the middle. And I said, are there any exceptions to that? And she said, well, the federal deficit, we really can't have a federal deficit. Okay. And I said, what about Israel? And she said, oh yeah, there's no middle ground in Israel. We have to support Israel. So, I don't think, and I want to be clear, I'm not alleging, I don't think that there's some big conspiracy going on here. I think, all the factors I named, it's, who are the donors? If you read most of these organizations, if you look at their policy papers, I'm not reading into it too much. They say it there, they just don't lead with it when they're, giving a press conference or something. So, yeah, I don't think that anyone's behind anything in some nefarious way, but I don't know too much about. Right, yeah. I would say the short answer is no. I don't believe that national Jewish organizations are backing No Labels, but there is overlap between the folks who are supporting them and folks who support, some Jewish groups.
You probably have
answered my question in one way or another, but why at this point in history are we seeing this rise in anti-Semitism sort of across the board? When COVID came out, even a Hungarian president said the Jews were at fault. You know, why at this point in history? I know that the Arab leaders who are part of the UN are trying to say that Israel has no connection, the Jewish history has no connection to Israel. So it's like, why at this juncture in history, in time, is this beginning to come to the forefront like it is?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the, what I hope to communicate is I think that we have a short memory. So it's happening now, but it was happening before. It was happening much worse before. So in that sense, we've made a lot of progress. But I think it's that coarsening of the political discourse. It's the rise of, populist leaders in countries all around the world who do things like blame minority groups, and Jews are sort of blaming Jews as like the kind of conspiracy, scapegoat. And so, even if you're running on a platform, I mean, in Hungary has good relations with the Israeli government. I think Netanyahu's son is buddies with some folks on the far right there. So they're not always specifically blaming Jews, but it's a type of politics that is historically very dangerous for the Jewish people. So I think, that's a big part of it, and we're seeing it alongside attacks on other, minority groups. So I don't know that it's unique to every situation. It's different, unique to anti-Semitism. I think we're seeing a lot of rise in hatred and sort of rough politics. Should I be calling on people, or is there?
We're just gonna take one or two more, and then we're gonna wrap it up.
Well, you said that it was worse in the past. I'm one of those that has a lot of fear, and I'm wondering why you don't think this is the beginning of something that's going to, roll into something much worse. I'm worried that I don't hear Jews getting together and talking about this as in a community. I don't. And I think my feeling about that was that some of the people I know have had a good time in the United States. They're affluent, and they're not taking this as seriously as I think they should. So I believe, and the question to you is it the beginning of something and that you have your head buried in the sand about?
Yeah, well, 2020 hindsight. I mean, I think this relates to the first question that, like, for Jews, there's a big reaction, especially when things start to get worse. I think that's what Rabbi Saberstein was saying, is that, in the past, things might have been worse, but we saw them getting better. And we really don't like when things start to get worse, because I think we all go toward, what happens when things do get really bad, and we have a long history of evidence that answers that question. And, I don't know what the future holds. What I do know is that the statistics that we have, the data that we have about anti-Semitism in the United States suggests that people hold very warm, 70% of the country has a favorable view of Jews as a religious group. That's higher than any other group in the country. The most egregious cases of anti-Semitism that we see come from the fringes. The shootings are being carried out by extremists who are condemned even by the politicians they claim to support. Whether or not those condemnations are, as sincere as we would like, it's still unacceptable. I mean, when Kanye West had those outbursts, he immediately took a couple weeks, but he became radioactive, lost all of his contracts, etc. And so I think that's a lot of reason for comfort. And I think we had another question about why more people aren't talking about anti-Semitism, but I would point to this lecture series. I would point to the 40 new organizations created since 2015. I would point to the record fundraising by the ADL, to the White House just released this plan. There's not a plan to stop anti-black racism, to stop sexism, to stop Islamophobia, but now we have a plan on how the federal government's going to act to stop anti-Semitism. I think those are all reasons to feel good, but I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, that's true.
I would like to know the frequency of anti-Semitic comments that you receive for reporting about anti-Semitism.
Yeah, I almost put in that, by the standard of that ad where the garage door was spray painted, I could be included in that list of Jewish victims of hate, although I feel like I'm doing okay. I don't know, it's kind of, I sort of tune it out, which is why it's hard to answer. I'm trying to remember. I mean, almost all of the anti-Semitic stuff comes from anonymous folks, which is easy to ignore, and I would say probably most of it comes from people who identify as Jewish, who, you know, I'm a capo, or we're, you know better than the Nazis, et cetera, so, which I would consider anti-Semitic. So yeah, it's not a huge amount, but there are definitely nasty comments on social media and, you know, angry people emailing, but, you know, I've had experiences with anti-Semitism outside of work that were probably more alarming and rattling than those ones.
Okay, we have one last question.
Hi. I was just wondering why, first I will say there is a lot of ignorance about Judaism. We are not, the Jews tend to keep to themselves, and I think that there has to be a lot more PR about us. We have to have people going out and talking about what is Judaism. They have to have maybe classes to talk about it. There isn't enough telling people who we are, and people are ignorant about it.
Yeah, I mean, one thing we do know is that, which is good news, I think it's great news, is that people who know Jews tend to like Jews more and tend to think anti-Semitism is more of a problem. And, you know, there's been a lot of talk, obviously, over the years about intermarriage in the Jewish community and this threat to the Jewish future. But a number of folks look at that as sort of the inverse, that isn't the fact that, you know, for many years it was hard for Jews to marry outside of the Jewish community. Now a lot of people want to marry Jews. So yeah, I think that, you know, getting out into the community, meeting more people, et cetera, is a positive thing.
So Arno, I just have no choice but to chime in on that too, which is to say, well, we just opened a new exhibit at the museum titled Judaism, An Intimate Perspective, and if you haven't had a chance to come and see it, please do, because it is battling that ignorance that you speak of.
Absolutely.
Arno, thank you so very much.
Thank you everyone.
I have to say that Arno set this bar for the Lakin Lecture Series quite high, and it's going to be very difficult for those that follow you. I would ask that you all take a moment and also help me thank the Lakin Lecture, the Lakin family, and also Jewish Philanthropies of Southern Arizona for supporting this important and timely initiative. And also that you help me thank the J. Todd, Naomi, Noah, your team is always such gracious hosts, and we are so grateful. And then finally, I thank all of you for coming out tonight, and all of you who joined us in the live stream. Supporting our mission means so much to us, and supporting this initiative is so important. So thank you all, and have a wonderful night.